war in the United States. We'll be speaking with Tom Engelhardt. Stay with us. Desert Night by Kayhan Kalor and Mr. Shajarian. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We go now to Afghanistan, where the Ministry of Mines has announced Thursday it is taking the first steps toward opening the country's vast mineral resources to international investors. News of Afghan's mineral reserves made headlines earlier this week when the New York Times detailed findings of the Pentagon and U.S. Geological Survey that Afghanistan has at least $1 trillion in untapped mineral wealth. Afghan officials suggested the reserves could be worth as much as $3 trillion. Meanwhile, back on Capitol Hill, debate over the U.S. war effort continues. Senior Pentagon and military officials spoke to lawmakers Wednesday to urge patience and support for their operations. The head of U.S. Central Command, General Petraeus, told the Senate Armed Services Committee that the war was moving in the right direction and they were on track to begin withdrawing forces from Afghanistan by next summer.
The conduct of a counterinsurgency operation is a roller coaster experience. There are setbacks as well as areas of progress or successes. It is truly an up and down when you're living it, when you're doing it, even from afar, frankly. But the trajectory, in my view, has generally been upward, despite the tough losses, despite the setbacks.
For more on the ongoing U.S. war in Afghanistan, the longest-running war in American history, we're joined now here in New York by author Tom Engelhardt. He's the creator and editor of the website TomDispatch.com. His latest book is called The American Way of War, How Bush's Wars Become Obama's. His latest post on Tom Dispatch is called Call the Politburo. We're in trouble entering the Soviet era in America. What do you mean? Welcome to Democracy Now!, Tom.
What I mean is that in the Cold War, which we've largely forgotten at this point, the Soviet leaders made a kind of a basic miscalculation. They mistook military power for global power. They poured all their money, functionally, into their military. They got stuck in Afghanistan, very much like us, for 10 years. In the meantime, their budget deficits were going up. They were growing. Their indebtedness to other countries was growing. Their infrastructure was beginning to crumble. This very society they had built was beginning to crumble. And when the Red Army came out of Afghanistan, it limped out in 1989 after a decade. It basically returned to a country that didn't exist because within 2 years, the Soviet Union collapsed. In Washington, this caught everybody by surprise. Everybody expected the Cold War to go on and on. When American leaders saw this happen, they declared victory. The world was without an enemy at this point, and they in one of the more striking decisions, I think, that's been made in many, many years, they decided then to follow the Soviet path. And they began, and they put the so-called peace dividend in a ditch, and they began to pour money, successive administrations, as we know, up through the Bush administration into today, into the American military while budget deficits rose, indebtedness rose, infrastructure crumbled, and the society began to weaken. Now, the United States is not the Soviet Union. It was always by far the more powerful country, and it isn't today the Soviet Union in 1989 or 1991. But it is striking that our leaders, in declaring victory, decided to go down, in essence, the Soviet path, which was the path to implosion.
You spend quite a bit of time on the book in one chapter talking about the language of war and how the American media portrayed Muslim resistance fighters in other wars, initially in the first war in Afghanistan against the Soviets and in Chechnya as well. Could you talk about the language of war?
Well, if you go back in the 1980s, of course, we were supporting many of the very people we're now fighting. And at that point, they were not Muslim extremist whatevers. They weren't Islamic totalitarians. They were, well, the president said it at the time. That was President Reagan. He called them freedom fighters. And when you look at the language in the press for these very same people doing many of the very same things, it just happened to be against the Soviets. Car bombs, camel bombs, bike bombs, suicide attacks, so on and so forth. And this included Osama bin Laden and so on and so forth. They were portrayed as resistance fighters. You would never see the word resistance fighter put with the Taliban. Nor, to give you an example, in the Iraq War, it was very interesting. The phrase that the military often used for those they were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan is they referred to them as anti-Iraqi forces or anti-Afghan forces, as if they were foreigners. And of course, nobody would refer to us as anti-Iraqi forces or foreign forces or anything of the sort. I mean, there's a whole language that goes with American-style war. To give you just a simple example, and you hear it relatively often, when things start to go badly, American officials, Robert Gates said it relatively recently,